Okay, so hello everyone. We're back for another very insightful Facebook Live this afternoon. So last week we had the Facebook Live about the struggles in writing, super useful information, and now Coach Jess will be talking about another very relevant topic. But first and foremost, let me introduce myself. I'm Nix, and I'm the social media virtual assistant of Coach Jess. And without further ado, let me give the floor to the star of this Facebook Live, Coach Jess.
Well, thank you, Nix, and it's so wonderful having you here with me, no longer having to do my lives all by myself. Um, so I'm excited to talk about homeschooling today. It's a passion of mine. So do you have any questions for me about homeschooling?
Okay, so our topic today is all about homeschooling, and I prepared three questions for you today. So let me start with the first question. I'm sure everyone would like to know more about it. So, just for you, is what is homeschooling, or can you share with us your experience in homeschooling?
Sure. So I started homeschooling my children um, back in 2010. Actually, I only homeschooled one of my children because he was struggling socially with school, and he had asked to be homeschooled since first grade. And my husband and I didn't want to start homeschooling him um, for that, for the reason that he asked, because we didn't understand all of the innuendos with public school and homeschooling back then, and we didn't understand that it was just very hard for him. He had a lot of anxiety with being in traditional school, and so after he was up in his room one in the bathroom actually crying one Sunday night about going back to school, it was 1 o'clock in the morning. I told my husband I can't send him back to school, so I started homeschooling him, and I had three other kids still in traditional school. So we lived in a small town. One kid I drove to the elementary school, one kid I drove to the middle school, and one kid I drove to the high school. So I spent most of my day driving kids to and from school. And we lived in a small town in Texas, and it was a really good public school, especially compared to the public schools that my kids had gone to in Las Vegas. So so anyway, we I didn't really plan on homeschooling. It just sort of happened. And then we were leaving Texas and moving back to Las Vegas, where the schools at the time were the worst schools in the entire country. So I didn't want to have my kids go back to public school there. And we had them in private school, but because of 2008, we couldn't afford to put them back in private school. So so we decided to homeschool our youngest son as well. And my daughter was going to the public charter school, which was a performing arts school. And then my oldest son graduated from high school, and so he was going off to college. So um, so I started homeschooling two kids in 2011. And then my daughter, who has profound dyslexia, and she did great. They really were accommodating for her in the public schools in Texas, but in Las Vegas, they were not at all accommodating. I was constantly going into the school and telling them that they weren't following her IEP and that she wasn't supposed to read out loud and she wasn't supposed to do things. And she would get A's and B's in her performing arts classes, in her dance classes, in her music classes, in her creative, anything creative, she'd get A's, and pretty much A's. But in her core classes, she was getting C's and D's. And she wasn't feeling like she was treated well by the teachers. and they didn't understand dyslexia, and they just had expectations of her, like with memorizing music notes, and she couldn't do that. And so I we decided as a family that I would start homeschooling her. So I actually started homeschooling her junior year of high school. So I homeschooled all three of them, my my younger three kids. The My daughter, I only homeschooled her for her last 2 years of high school. My son, I started homeschooling in Texas. I homeschooled him from 5th grade until I graduated him. And my other son, I started homeschooling in 3rd grade until I graduated him last year. So most people will homeschool the earlier years and they're nervous to do it the later years. But for us, we started the later years, and we found that it really worked well for our family, and especially their struggles, their academic struggles. So we did it till the end of their educational career. So
Okay, okay. That's actually a very interesting and amazing experience. I think that you're really destined to be able to help a lot of people with learning differences. And it's great that you started with your family. It's a very hands-on experience there.
okay.
Okay, so yes, let's move on to the next question. This is a very interesting question. Why do you say homeschooling is different than virtual school during COVID, during this pandemic?
So virtual school is nothing like traditional homeschooling, and it's really important for people to understand that, because um, a lot of people aren't doing well with the virtual school situation. And I'd hate for them to walk away thinking that what they are experiencing is what homeschoolers experience, because it's nothing like what homeschooling is like. Um, for first of all, um, virtual school, the teachers got thrusted into something they had no clue what to do or how to handle the situation. Their classes, they have 25 to 35 kids in a class, and they have to try to keep the attention of all of these kids while they're basically just lecturing them. Um, and they they're still not working with the students based on what their strengths and weaknesses are. They're just teaching it to the masses. So they've just tried to bring traditional school into the home on a computer. And for most students, it's not working very well, because they're feeling isolated. They don't have the support that they are need, and they don't know how to navigate through it. Homeschooling, on the other hand, typically, so there's different types of homeschooling, and I'm not going to really address the specifics of it, but I will say um, some of the different types of homeschooling are um, people bring the traditional school into their home, and they'll use workbooks with their children, or they'll have them just work on textbooks. That's one kind of homeschooling, and probably the least used. But I have met people. I knew one family, the mom was a teacher and she had three sons, and she had those cute little desks back from the early 1900s, late 1800s. And she had three of them set up and for her children, and then she had a desk for herself, and she literally brought the school home. But most of us who homeschool do not homeschool that way, because if we're pulling our kids out of school, why do we want um, to copy what wasn't working for them in school? So the many of the other ways of homeschooling are, there's the classical approach, which is children will read classical stories, or the parents will read the classical stories to their children, and the whole learning process revolves around that story, that book. So they might learn about the history of that time period of the book. They might they they might do a science experiment related to something in that book. They might go on a field trip that is associated with that book. So everything's kind of revolving around that. Classical, also, very often the students will learn Latin. And so when we first started homeschooling, my kids did classical conversations, which is a group type of environment where they're learning the classical approach. And so once a week, the kids would go to class and have a tutor who would teach them a little bit about English, a little bit about science, a little bit about math, a little bit about Latin, and there was one other subject I just left out. Um, anyway, and then they would go home, and the rest of the week they would work on learning more about each of those subjects. And then, so that's more of the classical approach. Then there's more of a natural approach. There's, gosh, I am forgetting what it's called. Charlotte Mason, the Charlotte Mason approach. And that approach is, it came out of England, and it's more where the kids learn, they, like for science, they go out and they look at things in nature, and then they draw pictures about what they saw in nature, and then they write about it if they're old enough to write about it, and it's very hands-on. And it's kind of got some overlap with the classical approach. And then there's more of a child-led type of homeschooling, which is how I homeschooled my kids most of the time that I homeschooled, because we found that the classical conversations, the classical approach was not ideal for my family, because number one, we are all dyslexic, and so reading is harder. And number two, my youngest son and myself had a really hard time memorizing all the information that you needed to memorize in the classical approach. And I'm not saying that it's not a great approach. I think it's a wonderful approach. It just was not the best for my family. We found that the child-led program worked well, and that was, my kids did their core subjects, and we did science together. Actually, my kids kind of did science, just the two of them, because I don't really love science. So I would have my older of my youngest two children teach himself and his brother. We'd buy a science kit, and every year they did a different type of science that way, but they did it together. And then we always did history together. When it was the three kids, all three of them did it together. When it was down to the two kids, I would read, one year I read Around the World in 80 Days to them, and then we watched the movie when we were done reading it. And every time they would go to a different country in that book, we would cook a meal from a different country as well, so the kids were kind of immersed in that country as we moved along in the book. And then we've also listened to audiobooks with history. The first year we lived in California, my three kids did, they took American history at Disneyland. So every week they went to Disneyland, and there was a teacher there, and he taught them about different parts of American history around Disneyland. He also taught a class at Knott's Berry Farm about American history. So it's very hands-on. So they did their basics. Math that we always did separately, because my kids had very different math abilities. My daughter, when she first started homeschooling, did her own math, and she didn't she had a hard time adjusting to me not telling her when she needed to do it or what she needed to do. And that's one thing about the traditional schooled kids doing virtual school right now. They're not accustomed to um, being accountable for themselves and scheduling things. That was the hardest thing for my daughter to do at her age, after having been in traditional school her whole life, was to learn to be accountable for herself, which is a really good skill to have, because when they get to college they need those skills. And that's why colleges today really look, they like homeschoolers, because they know homeschoolers already have that skill. And typically traditional schooled kids don't know how um, to discipline themselves, and so they tend to not do so well their first year of college. So anyway, with the child-led homeschooling, um, in there, when we were beyond the core subjects, the kids picked what they wanted to learn. So they did parkour, they took horseback riding. My son Jacob, he went to uh, urban workshops where they learned how to use machinery that really kids aren't taught anymore. It's kind of like shop class. So he did that for 3 years. And then when he finished the program at 17, he had meanwhile graduated high school, and he got a job as a teacher at the urban workshop. So he started teaching other kids at 17 years old. And then at 18, he actually was teaching adult classes. And he got certified as a welder at 19, and started teaching welding classes to children and adults at 19. And then COVID hit. So he hasn't used his welding training beyond that. But so they were armed with focusing on things that they enjoyed, or trying out different things to see what they enjoyed, to so that as they the idea was, by the time they were at the age they are now, they would be able to really figure out what they were interested in. And COVID has kind
Hmm.
of put a halt on that. But my youngest son is really interested in creating graphic novels. And so he took a lot of art classes his last couple of years at school, because he couldn't draw at all. And it was hard for him to express um, what he wanted the graphic novel characters to look like. So his his drawing skills are good enough that he can do basic sketches, and then have an artist do it for him when he's ready to publish his graphic novels. So that's why I really like the child-led type of homeschooling. And then there's unschooling, which unschooling can vary a great deal, but the idea is that you don't force anything in particular on the child, and that when they want to learn something, they will come to the parent and say, hey, I want to learn how to sew. Hey, I want to learn how to read. Hey, I want to learn how to do math. Um, that works great for lots of families. In my personal experience as a professional dyslexia specialist, I find that unschooling is a little tricky for kids who have struggles with reading, because if reading's hard, they don't necessarily want to learn how to read. And so they can fall really far behind. And if they don't have a foundation in reading, it's hard to do anything else. I've also found that when a lot of unschoolers that we've had in our program, math, if they struggle with math, that's really, really hard for them at first, because they've taught themselves some really weird ways of doing math. And it's hard to retrain them, because they not, I don't want to generalize, but quite a few of the unschooled math students don't want to learn another way, because they think their way works, but their way only works for so long. And so it kind of becomes a detriment for them. For the language arts, it's actually, I think it's easier for the unschooled kids when they are ready to learn to read to go through the language arts program. Because a couple of unschooled kids that we worked with who were 18 at the time when they started, they actually moved up like 6 reading levels in a year and a half or 2 years. So reading, I feel like they can really get a lot easier than math, because a lot of times they don't try to learn to read, but they try to learn math, and they've tried on their own and it just hasn't worked. But even within those types of homeschooling, there's huge variations between families, between individuals. So there's no one way to homeschool. But hopefully that gives you a really clear idea of the fact that homeschooling is really different than traditional virtual school. And you were a teacher who at the beginning of COVID had to do virtual school.
Yes.
So tell us a little
Yes.
bit about what that was like, because I have no idea what virtual school is like, thank goodness.
Well, actually, when I was still a teacher and, COVID hit our country, I found it really difficult during the beginning. I found it really difficult to conduct virtual classes or online classes. Same with my students, because we're really used to the face-to-face setup, and the lessons, the pending lessons and activities were really created or made for face-to-face meetings. So the adjustments were really stressful. I had to extend my working time. I had to work at night just to change the activities, the lessons, so that it would match the virtual classroom setup. And with regards to the learning type of the students, since they're not so used to it, they're quite surprised with what happened. So the adjustment was also there, although you would notice that some students, they're not that focused, or they they tend to be easily distracted, especially that it's digital, and it's very easy to go to Facebook, open other tabs, open other websites. You're not sure if their attention is really there, 100% attention is really there. But since this is still the scenario, the situation, everyone must adapt to it in order for us to still continue educating, and for them to still continue learning, because learning and education, it's very, very important.
Yeah, yeah.
Hmm.
And a point that I totally forgot to mention is when it's not during COVID, homeschooling is a community type of a um, dynamics. It typically, people don't stay locked up in their home and never go out. There are some people who are very antisocial, or um, their situation is different. But most homeschoolers, if you go anywhere in the country, you can find a park day. And I like to explain park day kind of like recess on steroids. So um, a park day, you go to a park and you meet with other homeschool families, and the kids go run around and play with each other. Sometimes it's for an hour, sometimes it's for 2 hours. Some park days, they will be out at the park from 10:30 in the morning until 6:30 at night. So like 8 hours, they're one day a week, they're hanging out with their friends, and they're interacting with kids of all ages, not just everyone who's within 16 months of their age. So they're learning skills that people outside of traditional school, once you graduate from high school, you're interacting with people with different ages. The only time in your life you're stuck with people who are just your age is when you're in traditional school, from grade kindergarten to 12th grade. After that, you have to learn to communicate with people with other ages, which is one of the reasons why homeschoolers tend to be much more comfortable talking to adults. Number one, the ratio of the parent child, ratio is, most families don't have more than 6 or 7 kids. Most families only have 2 kids, but so your ratio is much lower than the classroom setting of 25 to 35 kids. And then you're interacting, when they go to park day, they're interacting with other people's parents, or other people's mothers are telling them, are disciplining the group, and they need to respond to that. And sometimes there's dads that go to park day as well, so it's not just moms. And then homeschoolers typically have classes, like we offer classes for homeschoolers, and they're small classes, but also in person. People will go to in-person classes. My kids went to, like I said, they went to Disneyland for a history class. They went to to a an office. My youngest son Sammy he took an abacus class because he struggled with math before I started offering math or teaching math. We looked for other alternative math programs for him, and he went to an abacus class for about a year. They've gone to writing classes, they've gone to, like I said, the shop class, they've gone to PE. So people think that homeschoolers are not socialized, but they're very much socialized. Sometimes homeschoolers are joke that they're socializing too much, that they're not getting any academics done, because it's very easy to go out and just spend all your time socializing. We go on field trips with other homeschoolers, we go to parties, they have parties in the park, they have parties at the house. And I've homeschooled in 3 different states. And all 3 states, it kind of had a different feel to it. California, people's homes tend to be smaller, and so most of the socialization is done outside. Plus, the weather is beautiful in Southern California most of the year. In Las Vegas, most people have big homes, and the weather is not beautiful in the summer. So we would spend more time in people's houses. We were part of a homeschool co-op where we went from house to house for the different subjects. And so, there was a large group of kids in one house. Texas, we went on field trips mostly, or we went to the park days, but sometimes we went to people's houses for small group activities. So Texas was kind of a hybrid between California and Las Vegas, because Texas has, where we were in Texas anyway, the weather's kind of mild. So it just depends. But just wanted to make sure I shared that as well, that homeschoolers are not isolated normally. Now, right now, a lot of them are isolated just like everyone else is. And you said there
Yes.
were 3 questions. So what's your last question?
Okay, so thank you for that very wonderful explanation for the second question. Now, our last question is, do you recommend virtual school or homeschooling for kids with dyslexia, dyscalculia, and similar learning differences?
So uh, what I've heard with most of our students, for most of them, the virtual school is not really working super well because they don't have any guidance. Their special ed services are not really happening the way they had. Not that the special ed services in schools typically are the right services anyway, but they're not even getting their extra help. So for most of the students, they're not thriving with the virtual school. Um, However, there are some students who have been doing better because they can type all of their responses and they don't need to be in a hurry and they don't feel the peer pressure of being in a classroom setting. Because very often when I do a consultation with a family, they'll talk about how low their child's self-esteem is because they're embarrassed, they feel stupid, they they think they're dumb because they're not able to do things as quickly as their classmates are. So, so virtual schooling has allowed them a little bit more freedom and flexibility. On the other side, I highly recommend homeschooling for kids with dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, and similar learning differences. Because, and even if it's only for a couple of years while the kids are catching up, but it gives them an opportunity. Like if we're tutoring them, all they have to do is focus on what we're teaching them. They don't have to work on what we're teaching them plus try to keep up with their classmates. And so homeschooling allows them an opportunity to go at their own pace. They don't have to keep up at the same pace as other students. Like my youngest son, when he first came home, he didn't read very well. I didn't realize, but he couldn't do math at all. They never talked about that at school. It wasn't until I started homeschooling that I realized it. And so he was behind for a very long time. And my original plan was to just homeschool him for a couple of years and get him caught up. But he didn't catch up in just a couple of years. It took him a lot longer. But by the time he graduated high school, he had caught up. He was reading at a much higher level than the average American or Canadian reads at when they graduate from high school. And so he needed that time to catch up. And had he been in traditional school, his self-esteem would have been lower, but he has a good self-esteem because he was young enough that he wasn't really aware, I don't think, of how much he was behind. Um, but also when he was in traditional school, we had to have him on ADHD medicine because he couldn't focus at all. And the teacher, like his first grade teacher, had him sit at a desk right attached to her desk to help him focus. Um, where once we started homeschooling him, we no longer had him on the meds. I mean, sometimes he seemed like he wasn't really focusing when I was teaching him, but I I would rather that than have had him on the meds for the rest of his life because it was just he changed as a person while he was on the meds, and we never really wanted our kids on meds, but he couldn't, there was no point in him going to school if he wasn't medicated because it was a waste of a day for him to be there. So he had to be medicated in school, but he didn't have to be medicated at home. um, so I don't know if that completely answers the question because it really depends on the individual with traditional school. But homeschooling, I think, is a win-win for anybody who's behind, and you can always put them back in school unless it's high school. And then you really need to check with your state to see whether they will, what their rules are, because I know California, once they're in high school, they have to if you pull them out, then they're going to have to go back in the school wherever you pulled, whatever grade they were in when you pulled them out. Where in Texas, I knew a girl who was homeschooled until high school, and in Texas they tested her, and she actually got skipped in some of her classes because she was so advanced academically that they put her wherever her academic strengths, wherever she scored on the tests. So it definitely varies from state to state. So, but for the younger kids, there's nothing to lose. And I would just like to point out, because I've been talking about virtual schooling not working super well for kids with dyslexia. And here now, our program is 100% online. But it works really well for kids with dyslexia, dysgraphia, and dyscalculia, pretty much the same, actually sometimes better than in person did, because our program is one-on-one. So, you're paying attention to the student, to the teacher the whole time. There's not a bunch of other kids. There's not other distractions. And our tutoring as well, the student is doing the work while they're working with the tutor. They're reading the paper in front of the tutor, and the tutor's correcting them immediately if they misread something. So it's completely different than what virtual school is. So I just wanted to give that clarification so that there's not any misunderstanding about that. So.
Okay, thank you very much for your wonderful answers. And I'm sure that our viewers, especially the homeschool moms, the homeschooling parents, they will really find the information that you shared with us today. They will really find it very useful for their homeschooling journey.
Yeah, and if someone isn't homeschooling now but considering homeschooling, I do homeschool consultations. So I'm happy to talk to parents and guide them, give them confidence, make recommendations of curriculum for their kids with learning differences. I cannot help with traditional schooled, I mean, not traditional schooled, but I cannot help with um, neurotypical homeschooling, because I just don't know. None of my kids that I homeschooled were neurotypical, so I am not adverse. I'm not versed in that area, but I'm very knowledgeable about helping families, and I've helped lots of families outside of my own family set up their homeschool curriculums or their homeschool plan for their child. And it's so that's an option available to families who may not be seeking out tutoring. So, you can schedule a 15-minute discovery call, and we can talk about whether that is something that is helpful for any families who are thinking about homeschooling but a little bit nervous. So thanks, Nix, for your great questions and for taking this time to come on Facebook with me so that I don't have to do it alone.
Okay, thank you very much as well, Jess. And yeah, thank you to our viewers today. And we'll be back for another very insightful topic next Thursday on our next Facebook Live.
Okay, bye.
Bye.